brazen violations. Mr. President, indeed, we are living with the DPRK's dangerous missile provocations on a near daily basis. In this regard, I have recognized, including today, that several misguided narratives floating around at the United Nations both contribute to the Council's inaction and blur the focus of the international community. Therefore, I would like to clarify the following 3 points. First, the DPRK argues that its continued ballistic missile provocations are mainly triggered by ROK-US military exercises. This simply does not hold water. The ROK-US combined defense and deterrence posture, including our joint exercises, is in response to the DPRK's military threat. Such defensive measures are a duty of responsible government at the least. Moreover, Pyongyang has conducted 6 nuclear tests and launched more than 200 ballistic missiles over the last several decades, according to their own plan, regardless of our military exercises or our policy toward DPRK, even during the period of our so-called sunshine policy. This is largely because the DPRK is obsessed with the advancement of its nuclear capabilities to sustain its very, very unique regime, despite the severe and ongoing suffering of its own people. The Council's failure to respond to the DPRK's serious provocation in May further emboldened the DPRK. Last September, Pyongyang promulgated its new law on nuclear weapons policy, which allows preemptive use of nuclear weapons on a dangerously arbitrary basis. In January of this year, Pyongyang declared it would mass produce tactical nuclear weapons and exponentially increase its nuclear arsenal. It has also declared its intention to pursue new types of ICBMs. Moreover, DPRK today announced that it conducted a nuclear counterattack simulation drill, threatening to use tactical nuclear weapons against the Republic of Korea. This palpably demonstrates that the DPRK declares its nuclear policies and conducts dangerous tests according to their own playbook. The DPRK is simply fine-tuning the timing of its provocations, considering relevant circumstances to fit its excuses. Second, according to another false narrative, the DPRK's so-called positive measures in 2018 to 19 had not been reciprocated. This simply isn't true either. The DPRK's nuclear and missile programs violate numerous Security Council resolutions, and in this sense, the DPRK's self-declared moratorium of nuclear and ICBM tests did not amount to a demonstration of so-called goodwill, but an obligation that it had always been required to follow. Pyongyang has neither provided the full picture of its nuclear program, which could serve as the first step for verification, nor even attempted to freeze its nuclear activities, even for a short period of time. The DPRK only took a few easily reversible measures, like the explosion of entrances of nuclear test site tunnels, and they actually reversed them. Third, some argue for a so-called balanced implementation of both sanctions and dialogue in the relevant Security Council resolutions. However, it is none other than the DPRK that does not respond and, in fact, further rejects outrightly the continued calls by the international community for dialogue and diplomacy, including the Republic of Korea's audacious initiative, as well as the U.S. call for dialogue without any preconditions. Some even argue that sanctions are ineffective. However, sanctions must be fully implemented by all, including Security Council permanent members, in order to be effective. Implementation of the existing Security Council resolutions is an obligation conferred on all UN member states by the UN Charter. The DPRK is now playing for time to further advance its unlawful nuclear and missile programs, taking full advantage of the weakened implementation of the sanctions and the paralyzed Security Council. Mr. President, we have vividly witnessed the DPRK's record number of 10 ICBM launches in a year in violation of enforcement measures decided by this esteemed body. Pyongyang's belligerent policy, menace of the functioning of the Security Council, and brazen mockery of the UN itself must finally come to an end, and its continued breach of international obligations must be held accountable by this Council. The Republic of Korea reiterates its commitment to engage in diplomacy with the DPRK and strongly urges the DPRK to stop its very dangerous behavior and respond positively to dialogue. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. This meeting is adjourned. The 9,288th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is reports of the Secretary General on the Sudan and South Sudan. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with the Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invited the representative of the Sudan to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. At this meeting, the Council will hear a briefing by Ambassador Harold Adlai Edgeman, permanent representative of Ghana in his capacity as chair of the Security Council Committee established pursuant to Resolution 1591 of 2005. I now give the floor to to His Excellency Ambassador Jong.
Mr. President, in accordance with paragraph 3A, Roman numeral 4 of Resolution 1591 of 2005, I have the honor to brief the Security Council on the work of the Sudan Sanctions Committee, covering the period from 7th December till today. During this reporting period, the committee issued its annual report for the year 2022, which is available on the committee's website. It held informal consultations and has received and considered the Sudan panel's final as well as its third and last quarterly updates. Mr. President, the panel of experts on the Sudan submitted its final report to the committee in December 2022. The committee members discussed the content of the report presented by the panel of experts on 6 February during the informal consultations. Following the committee's discussions, the committee considered the panel's recommendation and follow-up actions. The panel's final report was made publicly available on 7th February 2023. On that same day, the committee received the panel's third quarterly update, and on 10th March, the committee received the last quarterly update from the panel. In all its reports, the panel provided substantial information on the Juba Peace Agreement implementation process, the regional situation, the status of armed groups, and the protection of civilians. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the government of Sudan for extending its full cooperation to the panel during the past mandate. I would also like to take this opportunity to reiterate that the sanctions regime was established for the sole purpose of helping to bring peace to Darfur. It is not to punish Sudan, but to support the attainment of sustainable peace. The 1591 committee reiterates its commitment to work together with Sudan and all relevant stakeholders to make this a reality. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Ambassador Jong for his briefing. I now give the floor to the representative of the Sudan.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. شكرا السيد الرئيس.
On behalf. Thank you, sir. I would like to start by congratulating you generously for your country providing us access to the Council this time. We trust that you will lead our work with brilliance. The position of Sudan with regard to sanctions imposed under the Resolution 1591 is well known. The PVs of your council reflected sanctions were imposed in a political and security context which was different. At the time, there was an internal conflict in Darfur, which no longer exists. Darfur is now undergoing significant transition towards peace and building peace. And that will continue currently with the participation of the transition government and stakeholders in the peace agreement and the Juba peace agreement. Thanks to these efforts, Juba peace and stability are now prevailing. Stability is allowing voluntary return of people to their villages, which they had left during the height of the conflict. The transition government is endeavoring to implement the National Plan for Protection of Civilians. Untiringly, the plan was put to the Council in 2021, and we will continue to provide regular reports on implementation of the plan. Having said that, we are well aware that this situation is not ideal. There are intercommunal conflicts, which sometimes are due to competition about grazing, and this is partially due to climate change and its consequences. The Secretary General of the United Nations, in his autobiography called Resolve in a Divided Word, said the following. This is on page 119 of his book in English.
Just an ethnic conflict, but I believe the hostilities were based on competition for natural resources. ويعمل السودان على معالجة تلك
Sudan is endeavoring to resolve these conflicts through reconciliation and strengthening peaceful coexistence and deploying a joint force for civilian protection and strengthening the rule of law and reparative justice and its institutions. President, due to the relative resolutions on sanctions, we have to say they are no longer effective. These resolutions led to counterproductive consequences and undermine the law enforcement efforts to maintain peace and order and peaceful coexistence, which then helps the cross-border armed groups. Resolution 1591 especially did not have extensions at the like other council resolutions, and that's why this resolution throughout the 18 years has been used as a Damocles sword against Sudan. This is not due to an objective assessment by your council. Moreover, there is a growing feeling in Sudan that the resolution is no longer geared to bringing about peace and stability in Darfur. It has become rather a tool used by some members of your council to exercise political pressure against Sudan and its decision-making at the national level. The Council needs to seriously reflect on this matter so that sanctions do not become a tool used by some countries in order to serve their own political agendas. Some members of the Council have asked for the lifting of sanctions, including permanent members such as Russia and China. The African group, with 54 countries, and countries of the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, with 57 countries, have also asked for the lifting of these sanctions. The non-aligned movement supported these requests. Ladies and gentlemen, I take this opportunity to thank the friend countries who have taken objective points of view on Resolution 2676, adopted by your Council on the 8th of March. I also thank the A3 Gabon, Ghana, and Mozambique, and the UAE for their bitter negotiations that they led. Indeed, they supported Sudan's request to have a delay for the extension of the resolution at the urging of similar requests by other members of the Council. We also need to have realistic and objective, applicable and measurable criteria to be applied in making this decision. Several members supported the request, and we've seen to the extent at which the Security Council is divided on the evaluation of the content of the resolution. Some supported and others not. For the most part, the countries that were realistic come from the south, like Brazil, and they are able to understand the complex nature of the situation of a country that's dealing with transition, such as Sudan. These countries have no political agenda behind their positions, and we appreciate the position of these countries. Their position corroborates, practically speaking, corroborates their commitment to reform of the work of the Council. We hope that other countries will do the same in order to having double standards and not reducing the size of Sudan due to methodology based on the Greek idea of lying on a bed and then cutting off whichever parts of the body were too big to fit in the bed. We call upon your august Council in its conclusions to work to free Sudan. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the Sudan for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned. the 9,288 meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is reports of the Secretary General on the Sudan and the South Sudan. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with the Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of the Sudan to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with the Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Mr. Volker of Perthes, Special Representative of the Secretary General for Sudan and Head of the United Nations Integrated Transition Assistance Mission in Sudan, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2023/154, the report of the Secretary General on the situation in the Sudan and the activities of the United Nations Integrated Transition Assistance Mission in the Sudan. I now give the floor to Mr. Volker Perthes.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the Security Council. Thanks for the opportunity to brief you again. When I last briefed you on 8th of December, the Sudanese military and a broad range of civilian actors had just signed a political framework agreement. This was a watershed moment and ushered into a new phase of the political process, which aims to lead to a new transitional period. Today, we are the closest we have been to a solution, although challenges remain. Let me outline where we are. On 9 January, the signatories to the framework agreement, with the facilitation of the trilateral mechanism of African Union, IGAD, and United Nations, began broad consultations in the form of workshops on 5 contentious issues: the dismantling of the old regime, the Juba peace agreement, the east of Sudan, transitional justice, and security sector reform. Calling these consultations workshops is a bit of a misnomer. Each consultation gathered hundreds of Sudanese women and men. Most of them came from outside the capital, representing a broad social, professional, and political spectrum. And even some who had earlier publicly rejected the political process joined these conferences or workshops. Each workshop thus created space for public and transparent discussions among Sudanese citizens from all walks of life, including societal groups who often feel voiceless. And while the representation of Sudanese women fell short of the commitment to a 40% minimum, women actively participated in the discussions. Many areas of consensus emerged. In the workshop on the East, for example, important breakthroughs emerged, such as an agreement on a forum that will pave the way for future reconciliation in that region. The National Conference on Transitional Justice, which concludes today, was instrumental in advancing a common understanding of accountability and reconciliation. The reform of the security sector and the integration of forces are among the most sensitive elements of the current process. Last Thursday, military and civilian leaders signed a joint paper on phases and substance of security sector reform. This allows us, the trilateral mechanism, to launch the last workshop by the end of this week. It will focus on feasible options for the reform of the security sector and the integration of the rapid support forces and armed movements into one national professional army. And it will hopefully come up with an initial roadmap for the implementation of these steps in the years to come. Things are moving fast. Yesterday, the military and civilian signatories met the trilateral mechanism, the Quad and the European Union again, to confirm their commitment to the process and speak about the next steps. Based on their understanding, we, the trilateral mechanism, convened a preparatory meeting at the Republican Palace, where these parties agreed to begin the drafting process for a final political agreement and a transitional constitution. They also established a committee to reach out to non-signatory parties and movements and on a timeline. The aim is to reach a final political agreement, agree on the constitution, and begin the formation of a civilian government before mid-April. This is ambitious, but it can be done with the necessary political will. We, a trilateral mechanism, remain encouraged by how little substantive differences there remain among the main actors. This includes the leaders of two major armed movements who are members of the current military-led government but have not signed the framework agreement and did also not participate in yesterday's meetings. Their main differences with the signatories is not about the structures of the transition or the next government, but they wish to ensure their own representation in it. Joining the process and voicing their demands through the final political agreement would be the best way to guarantee this. The process has been a truly Sudanese one. We, the United Nations, and our partners in the trilateral mechanism have been actively facilitating it, and we will continue to do so. General Burhan, the chairman of the Sovereign Council, and General Hemeti, the vice chair, have repeatedly stressed that they want to see this process through and hand over power to civilian government. Their commitment and the cooperation in recent weeks of military and civilian leaders to reach a solution is highly commendable. At the same time, we have been alarmed by rising tensions between the Sudanese army and the rapid support forces in recent weeks. I have appealed to both sides for urgent de-escalation, and I was encouraged by the decision to establish a joint security committee last week and their agreement on fundamental aspects of security sector reform and integration. Civilian parties will now have to swiftly finalize discussions on the mechanisms to select a prime minister and form a government. A transparent engagement with the public, with the youth on the street, and with those who have not or not yet entered the process is necessary to build legitimacy for the future government. Ladies and gentlemen, time is essential. And the scale of challenges facing the people and any new government are enormous. Humanitarian needs in Sudan are at record levels, with 15.8 million people, about a third of the population, requiring humanitarian assistance this year. High food prices and rising hunger remain a serious concern. Local conflicts, particularly in Darfur, Blue Nile, the South and West Kordofan, and mainly over access to and control of resources, continue to result in the killing, injury, and displacement of civilians. Over 16,000 people were displaced due to conflict between December last year and February 2023. Just in one incident, last December in Blail in South Darfur, intercommunal clashes claimed the lives of at least 15, injured another 47, and displaced nearly 13,000. Increasing interventions by the authorities managed to de-escalate these situations and broker cessation of hostilities. In several instances, investigations were also conducted, which is a welcome development. At the same time, the deployment of the joint security-keeping forces continues to be delayed. And we are also concerned about reports of sexual violence in the context of these conflicts, which must be investigated. The Permanent Ceasefire Committee continues its monitoring. Encouragingly, no ceasefire violations were reported since my last briefing. In my recent meeting with the Joint High Military Committee, they repeated their call for more international support and for UNITAMS to continue its role as chair of the ceasefire committees. Humanitarian access is still a critical concern, as are bureaucratic and administrative impediments that hinder effective operations of the United Nations and our NGO partners. We remain in continuous dialogue with the authorities to address these concerns, including on the issuance of visas for UN staff. Slower responses entail less support and less timely support for the people of Sudan. We also continue our dialogue with the government on the implementation of the national plan on the protection of civilians. The protests against military rule have continued, albeit in lower numbers and with less frequency. While the excessive use of force has decreased over time, a young protester was fatally shot by a police officer in Khartoum on 28 February. The immediate action taken by the authorities to investigate his death and lift immunity from prosecution of the officer was promising. I urge the authorities to make visible progress on investigations into this and other human rights abuses and bring the perpetrators to justice. A court decision on 6 March to acquit and release 8 young men accused of killing a military intelligence officer last year was welcome, given the absence of evidence against them. I also welcome the release of 300 other men who were detained without charges on the orders of the governors of North and West Darfur in 2021 and 2022. The authorities must respect the due process rights of detainees and release anyone unlawfully detained. The United Nations also continues to work with the authorities and armed groups to ensure the release of children associated with armed groups. Over the last 2 months, 122 children, 92 boys and 30 girls were released in Darfur. Ladies and gentlemen, the challenges facing the next government are immense. Addressing pressing humanitarian and economic needs, ensuring security and justice and respect for human rights, peacemaking, and advancing the democratic transition are all critical demands of the Sudanese. The UN, with international partners, is coordinating and jointly planning collective support for the post-agreement transition phase and the government's priorities. We already convened an initial discussion continuing UN agencies, the IFIs and donors to support priorities of an incoming government, an expected incoming government, to support the priorities of an expected incoming government post-agreement. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to conclude by reminding us how far the Sudanese have come. When I briefed you last year around this time, the trilateral mechanism had just begun the process of shuttling between Sudanese stakeholders. At that time, protests were held every few days, and key actors did not want to talk, let alone negotiate with each other. Today, Sudanese stakeholders are closer than they have ever been to a settlement and the return to a civilian government. The process, certainly not perfect and occasionally criticized for being too slow, has managed to get a broad and sufficiently inclusive group of stakeholders, particularly the military authorities and civilian opposition parties, to near agreement. And as the Sudanese navigate this last hurdle, collective efforts from the international community are needed now more than ever. It is necessary to support the next government with the required capacity to tackle the major issues that have lain dormant, addressing root causes of conflict, implementing security arrangements, significantly improving the lives of Sudanese women and men, preparing free and fair elections. The united support of this Council will be crucial. Thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Volker Perthes for his important briefing. I will now give the floor to those Council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. Thank you also, SRG Perthes, for your briefing and for the continued efforts of UNITAMS on the ground. I also welcome the presence of the Permanent Representative of Sudan in our meeting today. President, I will make 4 broad points. First, I would like to commend the progress made since the announcement of the Framework Agreement on the 5th of December. The United Kingdom welcomes the wide and diverse range of participants involved in the completed workshops. We encourage the holding of the remaining workshops on security sector reform as soon as possible. As we approach Ramadan, it's essential to consolidate the progress made so far. So now is the time for all parties to seize momentum, accelerate their engagement, and reach a final agreement within the coming weeks. The United Kingdom is working with partners to ensure an early and coordinated offer of support to a civilian-led transitional government. We support the role of UNITAMS, the AU, and IGAD in facilitating the political progress and encourage non-signatories of the Framework Agreement to join these discussions and contribute to a final agreement. Second, we echo the Secretary-General's call for the Sudanese authorities to create conducive conditions to help negotiations succeed. In this light, we welcome the release of hundreds of Darfuri civilians from arbitrary detention. But we condemn the excessive use of force against protesters, which have resulted in the death of 125 protesters since the start of the coup. Third, President, the United Kingdom remains deeply concerned by ongoing intercommunal conflict across Sudan. We call on the Sudanese authorities to accelerate implementation of both the Juba Peace Agreement and the National Plan for the Protection of Civilians, and to deploy the Joint Security Keeping Force to Darfur. And lastly, the worsening humanitarian situation continues to have a devastating effect on ordinary Sudanese citizens. We urge the Sudanese authorities to remove all bureaucratic impediments which are hindering the ability of humanitarians to address the record levels of need. This includes urgently processing visas and lifting movement restrictions for UN personnel. President, in closing, the United Kingdom remains committed to the realization of the Sudanese people's calls for freedom, peace, and justice. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me to express my gratitude to SRSG Perthes for providing us with an informative update on the situation in Sudan. I also welcome the representative of Sudan to this meeting. Mr. President, the signing on the 5th of December of the Framework Agreement has renewed hope for a civilian-led transition that meets the aspirations of the Sudanese people, including the holding of elections. We commend the civilian and military signatories for the progress made so far, including the launching of the final phase of the political process in Khartoum on January 8th, facilitated by the trilateral mechanism. Albania urges non-signatories to join the political process and engage in meaningful talks to resolve remaining differences, and calls on signatories not to lose sight of this momentum. Furthermore, the political process must be comprehensive and have widespread public backing to be sustainable. While welcomes the release of hundreds of Darfuri detainees from prisons throughout the country, Albania remains concerned about the numerous reports of the excessive use of force on protesters. The current situation in Darfur and across the country demonstrates the urgent need for implementing the Juba process. We urge the authorities to investigate effectively, impartially, and in a timely manner any allegation of unlawful use of force or other alleged violations by members of the security forces. Demonstrators must be allowed to fulfill their right to peaceful assembly. Moreover, regrettably, women have continuously been underrepresented. We strongly encourage the parties to honor their commitment to include women in their delegations by 40%, including in leadership positions and in future transitional institutions. Mr. President, despite the progress on the political front, we remain concerned about the impact of intercommunal clashes in Blue Nile, West and South Kordofan, and Central, North and South Darfur states. Humanitarian needs continue to remain at a record level high. 18 million Sudanese will be under acute food insecure conditions in 2023, and a record of 11.7 million people, almost a quarter of the Sudan's population, are currently facing hunger. Therefore, we call on Sudanese authorities to provide unhindered humanitarian access to all affected. This current state of humanitarian conditions, grave violations of human rights, as well as the socio-economic situation in the country are worrying and require immediate attention. Albania is deeply concerned about the instances of sexual violence against women, particularly in IDP camps in Darfur. The fact that these incidents are underreported due to the victims' fear of shame, stigma, and retaliation must be alarming for all of us. Additionally, violations against children, boys and girls, by unidentified perpetrators is extremely troubling. Survivors and victims of sexual violence are shockingly often considered themselves as perpetrators of immoral activity. This practice, coupled with a lack of accountability, leads to silencing survivors and denying them access to justice. Mr. President, in conclusion, Albania reiterates its strong support to the trilateral mechanism and commends the work of UNITAMS and its dedicated team led by the SRSG. Although international assistance remains crucial, all stakeholders involved need to seize the momentum and put their own interests aside. Because it's only through a civilian-led political process, spearheaded and owned by the Sudanese, that a lasting resolution can be achieved. The Sudanese must be offered the chance for a stable country, which is able to provide basic services for all. This is what they deserve. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Señor Presidente,
Sir, I would like to thank the Special Representative of the Secretary General, Mr. Volker, Perthes, for his statement and for the work done by the integrated mission for the transition in Sudan. I recognize the presence of the permanent representative of Sudan in this session. Ecuador would like to convey its solidarity with the people of Sudan and advocates for overcoming the political, economic crisis, insecurity crisis, and food crisis, so they can make progress towards inclusive civilian rule of law-based administration. We also appreciate the framework agreement that was signed recently that cements the desire for an inclusive government with a new civilian government, including credible, transparent, and inclusive elections. We take note of what has happened in recent days and what we just heard about from Mr. Perthes, and to whom we'd also like to express our gratitude. We reiterate that the participation of women is unavoidable for the success of this political process, and therefore we urge all signatories of the agreement to maintain their commitment to the framework agreement, especially with regard to representation of women in positions of leadership and in future designations of transition authorities. This council needs to also encourage non-signatory groups to the Yuba agreement to join the peace process. The commitment and involvement for the construction of a social dialogue are key tools. The situation of violence, especially in the states of the Blue Nile, Kordofan, West Kordofan, Southern Kordofan, and Darfur, continue to be a source of concern, with hundreds of deaths, including 7 women and 1 child, during the period reported upon. And therefore, we urge the Sudanese authorities to redouble their efforts to protect civilians. The National Plan for Civilian Protection continues to be vital in order to increase protection for the communities. What's required to that end is improving early warning mechanisms and guarantee accountability, which is indispensable in order to build trust. Finally, we are concerned about the bureaucratic impediments and security impediments that limit the international community's capacity to provide humanitarian assistance to the most needy. Moreover, some 15.8 million people, or more or less equivalent to a third of the population, requires humanitarian assistance. We would urge the authorities to eliminate all barriers immediately and that they respect the agreement on the status of the mission, including through the lifting of restrictions on circulation of United Nations personnel. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, SRSG Perthes, for your very thoughtful briefing. Reaching a final political agreement on a new civilian-led transitional government is essential to end Sudan's political crisis and address its urgent political, economic, security, and humanitarian challenges. We acknowledge the significant work done in Phase 2 of the framework agreement process and urge the parties to capitalize on it by swiftly finalizing agreement on a new civilian-led government and interim constitutional arrangements that allow Sudan to resume its democratic transition. We acknowledge that military leaders have reiterated their willingness to withdraw the military from politics. We call on all parties to put Sudan's national interest above narrow political ends and urgently and constructively engage with one another to reach a final political agreement that realizes the Sudanese people's continued calls for freedom, peace, and justice. In support of this and recognizing the fragility of democratic transitions, the United States will promote accountability for spoilers, whether military or political actors, who attempt to undermine or delay Sudan's democratic progress. We continue our support for this Sudanese-led process in close coordination with the trilateral mechanism. We urge all parties to engage in good faith dialogue and ensure women, youth, displaced persons, and representatives from all over Sudan have the opportunity to participate in shaping their country's future. For this process to succeed, the the parties must foster an environment conducive to the participation of all stakeholders so they may freely express their views without fear of retribution. Furthermore, all Sudanese must be protected from all forms of violence. Full respect for the freedoms of association, expression, and peaceful assembly is vital. We have consistently condemned violence against and unjust detentions of peaceful protesters. We renew the call for those responsible to be held accountable. Turning to Darfur, we note that the security situation remains extremely volatile and dangerous, and we note with concern increased tensions and violence in other regions. Chronic violence highlights the urgent need for Juba Peace Agreement implementation, including the full deployment of the Joint Security Keeping Forces in Darfur, inclusive security sector reform, and comprehensive, inclusive, and transparent transitional justice processes. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président,
President, I would like to thank the Special Representative for his briefing. I welcome the participation of Sudan in this meeting. I will stress 4 points. The re-establishment of a democratic transition in Sudan remains the priority. We call on all Sudanese political forces to follow the spirit of compromise, which made it possible to reach the framework agreement of the 5th of December 2022. All actors must give priority to unity and broaden the political basis of the framework agreement. This cooperation is critical to address the issues that remain outstanding. Discussions must bear in mind the imperative need for the effective participation of women. The re-establishment of a credible democratic transition is critical to rebuild the trust of the international community. The Secretary General, in his report, laid out the challenges that the civilian government will have to address once it has been set up. We welcome UNITAM's efforts to prepare this approach. We will be ready to play our role working with the international community and our European partners as soon as the civilian government has been set up and as soon as the conditions have been met. President, the current status quo is fragile and severely affects the Sudanese population, notably in the suburbs. I'm thinking first of all of the humanitarian situation, to which the European Union has responded by mobilizing 78 million euros in 2022. We're also concerned by the high level of intercommunity violence whose root causes persist. All actors must put an end to the recruitment of combatants, which is only fueling escalation on the ground. The Juba peace agreements have set out a framework that has a timetable that has to be respected, including the reintegration of signatory armed groups and the deployment of a joint force. The first stages have been taken, but progress needs to be stepped up. President, finally, we call on the authorities to cooperate with UNITAMS and therefore to get rid of the obstacles that are affecting its functioning, blocking staff visas or restrictions on their freedom of movement, go against the agreement on the status of the mission. In a difficult context, UNITAMS continues to fulfill all of the missions that were given to it by the Security Council, and we welcome the joint facilitation by the UN, the African Union, and IGAD, which we have tirelessly supported. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for his statement. There was an accident here on the list of speakers, but we revert back to it. I give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank SRSG Mr. Volker Perthes for his insightful briefing. The Security Council has authorized 4 pillars in the mandate of UNITAMS, and several significant developments can be found in each domain. Today, I would like to take each in turn. First, regarding the political transition, Japan welcomes the recent positive political developments, above all, the signing of the political framework agreement last December. Japan also commends the work of the trilateral mechanism, namely UNITAMS, the AU, and IGAD in implementing this agreement. In particular, the trilateral mechanism has been facilitating the workshop on the 5 outstanding issues. Japan welcomes the wide participation of different stakeholders, including women, youth, and representatives from all over the country in these workshops. Although the percentage is still short of the aim set by UNITAMS, Japan welcomes that significant numbers of women have actively joined the workshops. Launching the final phase of the political process on January 8th, and yesterday's announcement on the agreed schedule of the political process were also important steps forward towards bringing back a civilian-led transitional government. The Council should encourage non-signatories of the agreement to join the process. We should also urge regional and international partners to support this Sudan-led, Sudan-owned political process in line with and in close consultation with the trilateral mechanism. Second, we need to further support the peace process and implementation of the Juba Peace Agreement and future peace agreement. Slow implementation of the Juba Peace Agreement and the National Plan for Civilian Protection is of serious concern. Japan welcomes every effort that the Sudanese government makes in moving forward on these two arrangements. We also urge the government to further strengthen its measures to counter inter-communal violence, which has led to large-scale internal displacement. Third, concerning peace building, civilian protection and the rule of law, we are deeply concerned by the excessive use of force against peaceful protesters who practice their legitimate rights of peaceful gathering. We call upon the authorities to take appropriate measures to stop these acts against non-violent demonstrators. Last but not least, we pay close attention that conditions for ordinary Sudanese are worsening. It is of the utmost importance to bring back a civilian-led transitional government that can ensure that Sudan receives sufficient humanitarian assistance from the international community. Mr. President, let me conclude by reiterating Japan's full support for the role of UNITAMS. Last December, Japan decided to make a contribution of $664,435 to support UNITAM's activities in Blue Nile and South Kordofan. Japan remains firmly committed to supporting Sudan's democratic transition and the aspiration of the Sudanese people for peace, freedom, and justice, and encourages the Sudanese government to enhance its effort in this regard. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, I thank the Special Representative of the Secretary General, Mr. Perthes, for his presentation. I also welcome the presence of the representative of Sudan at this meeting. Sudan is at a critical juncture to restore its democratic transition, and the hopes of the Sudanese people for freedom, peace, and justice rest on this. Switzerland welcomes the constructive engagement and progress made in recent weeks in addressing the 5 key issues identified in the 5 December Framework Agreement. We call on the signatories to continue their dialogue efforts and on the political forces that remain outside of the Framework Agreement to engage constructively. The renewed commitment of the leadership of the Sovereign Council to hand over power to a civilian government is a further encouraging signal. We recognize a key role that the United Nations Integrated Transition Assistance Mission in Sudan, UNITAMS, as well as the African Union and IGAD are playing in facilitating this process. Mr. President, now is a time for this progress to be translated into a political agreement without delay, and there are 3 key reasons for this. First, a political solution at the national level is essential to improve the humanitarian, economic, and security situation across the country. We remain deeply concerned about the continued violence in Darfur, Kordofan, and Blue Nile. This violence, which primarily affects the civilian population, is unacceptable. We call on all parties to respect international humanitarian law. Switzerland welcomes the work of the Darfur Permanent Ceasefire Committee, one of the few mechanisms of the Juba Peace Agreement which have been established. This committee, supported by Switzerland since its creation, plays a key role in diffusing tensions. However, more needs to be done to tackle insecurity as human suffering continues to grow. Nearly 16 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance. This is the highest number since 2011. Second, with the imminent return of civilian leadership, we need to invest in strengthening an inclusive transition backed by broad public support. The efforts of the civilian and military signatories to broaden the participation of various actors in the 5 dialogue processes are an encouraging sign. However, despite their engagement, women remain underrepresented throughout the process. This must change. Women have been at the forefront of the Sudanese revolution, and their full, equal, and meaningful participation remains absolutely crucial to the success of the political transition. We call on all parties to keep their promises to ensure at least 40% representation of women in future transitional institutions. Third, a strong commitment to justice will be fundamental to restore the trust of the Sudanese people in the country's authorities and in breaking the cycle of violence. Those responsible for human rights violations and abuses must be held accountable. We remain deeply concerned about recurring reports of sexual and gender-based violence against women and girls in the IDP camps in Darfur. The recent visit of the expert on the human rights situation in Sudan is an important step here. We reiterate his call for a comprehensive and inclusive transitional justice process tailored to the different regions of the country, focused on the needs of the victims and taking into account the gender dimension. Mr. President, although a political agreement is a significant step forward, the real work will only begin thereafter. Switzerland will continue to support the transition in Sudan and to engage with the Sudanese people on the road to a more peaceful future. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to begin by thanking Ambassador Aguiman for his briefing and chairmanship of the 1591 committee. I also thank Special Representative Perthes for his very important briefing today and his leadership in UNITANS. I also want to welcome Ambassadors Al-Hadith, Idris Al-Hadith Mohammed, and Sudan's representatives to this meeting. Mr. President, last time the Council heard a briefing from Special Representative Perthes, the Sudanese military leadership and a broad range of civilian actors had just converged to sign up a political framework agreement. Even though we could then commend the efforts that had led to the 5th December agreement, today's vantage point affords a much more precise appraisal of Sudan's political developments. As the Secretary General pointed out in his latest report, signing the framework agreement renewed hope for resuming a civilian-led transition in Khartoum. We commend the commitment to a long-term solution to the political deadlock that the signatories of the framework agreement have displayed so far. We encourage the signatories of the framework agreement to advance the implementation of the Juba Peace Agreement, debate how transitional justice can become integral to the public policy all over Sudan, especially in Darfur, Blue Nile, and South Kordofan, and take further steps towards security sector reform. The participation of local communities and leaders is undoubtedly crucial to address these issues adequately. We thus appreciate that community representatives, civil society groups, women's leaders, youth leaders, and even resistance committees have participated in the pertinent conferences. Mr. President, the principle of Sudanese ownership and leadership of the transition naturally remains critical. The Sudanese people will rightly judge the success of a civilian-led transition through the lenses of Sudanese ownership and leadership. We thus commend the United Nations African Union, IGAD, trilateral mechanism for continuing its efforts to support and facilitate the civilian-led transition under the core principle of Sudanese ownership. We particularly appreciate the steps of the trilateral mechanism has taken to engage Sudanese stakeholders who have not yet signed the framework agreement. We encourage these political actors to join the agreement and participate in formal proceedings. Sudanese ownership is coherent with comprehensive, truly national consultations. We commend how the trilateral mechanism has enabled broad participation not only in formal dialogues, but also in grassroots activities. Mr. President, intercommunal violence and armored conflict remain a concern, especially in Darfur, the Blue Nile State, and South Kordofan. Although UNITAMS supports peace processes in Sudan and the implementation of the Juba Peace Agreement, protecting civilians have become an exclusive responsibility of Sudanese authorities since UNAMID concluded its withdrawal. Therefore, suitable protection of civilians and sustained peace also rely on the progress of the civilian-led political transition. We commend the ongoing conflicts resolution initiatives and welcome the Sudanese authorities' support for peace-building efforts. After all, mediation endeavors, peace-building initiatives, and reconciliation projects are among the seeds of a lasting peace. In-depth reforms are necessary to address the root causes of violence. Security sector reform is perhaps the most important one. Bearing in mind the situation on the ground and the challenges faced by Sudan and its people, we encourage Sudanese authorities to prioritize progress on this front. Mr. President, let me conclude by reiterating Brazil's support for Sudan, the Sudanese people, and UNITANS. We are hopeful that Sudan will reach an inclusive, civilian-led political settlement. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil for their statement, and now give the floor to the representative of China.
Mr. President, I thank SRSG Perthes for his briefing and welcome the presence of the permanent representative of the Sudan at today's meeting. Recently, progress has been made in the political situation in Sudan. After the signing of the political framework agreement by the main Sudanese parties last December, the final phase of the political process was launched this past January with four special meetings facilitated by the tripartite mechanisms of the UN, the AU, and IGAD to resolve the 5 outstanding issues identified in the framework agreement. Yesterday, relevant parties held a preparatory meeting in which consensus was reached on the roadmap and timeline for the drafting of political agreement and the transitional constitution. All this provides an important opportunity for all parties in Sudan to bridge differences and reach consensus. China is encouraged by the political will and the spirit of consultation shown by all parties involved in this process and supports all parties in staying on the Sudanese-led and Sudanese-owned political process and continuing the inclusive dialogue so as to expand consensus and finding a development path suitable for the country. Meanwhile, the economic and humanitarian situation in Sudan is worrying. According to the assessment of the UN, in 2023, 1/3 of Sudan's population needs humanitarian assistance, and reduced international funding seriously constrains the humanitarian relief work. We called on relevant countries and international financial institutions to resume economic assistance to the Sudan immediately and unconditionally. Some countries attach political strings to aid and link aid to Sudan's political process, which not only interfere in Sudan's sovereignty, but also disregard the basic human rights of the Sudanese people, such as the right to subsistence and development. We hope that UNITAMS will step up efforts to mobilize international aid to alleviate the difficulties faced by the Sudanese people. Mr. President, we have noticed that while intercommunal clashes still occur from time to time in Sudan, the number of security incidents is declining. This is inseparable from the efforts of the Sudanese government. We welcome the timely visit by the Sudanese government to the conflict-affected communities, its commitment to hold the perpetrators to account, its efforts to bring about reconciliation agreements among the communities concerned and the series of responsible and effective initiatives it has taken. We also welcome the important role of the Darfur Permanent Ceasefire Commission in monitoring the security situation on the ground and called on the international community to provide financial and technical support to Sudan so that it can ensure the establishment and operation of various mechanisms provided for in the Juba Peace Agreement. China has reservations on the Council's continued imposition of sanctions on the Darfur region of the Sudan, and we elaborated our position when the Council adopted the resolution on sanctions against Sudan this month. We have repeatedly stressed that the Council's continued sanctions against Darfur not only lacks political and security basis, but also limits the efforts by the Sudanese government to maintain stability, protect civilians, and combat crimes on the ground. We oppose the politicization and perpetuation of sanction measures and urge relevant parties to face squarely the improved situation in the country and heed the call of regional countries for lifting sanctions against Sudan, stop using sanctions for political manipulation, and make efforts towards the lifting of sanctions. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we are grateful to the Special Representative of the Secretary General, Mr. Volker Perthes, for the information he provided about the developing situation. We took note of the 90-day report by the PR of Ghana, Mr. Harold Agimana, on the work of Security Council 1591 Sanctions Committee, and we welcome the participation in our meeting today by the Permanent Representative of Sudan to the United Nations. We follow very closely the developing situation in Sudan. The political landscape there remains volatile, and the prospects for further development are open-ended. We welcome the fact that the leadership of the country shows that they're ready to interact constructively with the various components of the civil society in Sudan, and this is what made it possible to sign on the 5th of December 2022 of the Framework Political Agreement with the participation of the Central Council fraction of the former governing coalition, which is called Forces for Freedom and Change. We note that discussions continue in the country on outstanding issue, and this is done inter alia with the support of regional states. We would like to hope that these efforts will have a stabilizing effect on the situation in the country. At the same time, we note that the Framework Political Agreement left outside some significant players, political players in the country, and they continue rejecting it. We think that artificially pushing forward the current political process will hardly help arriving at a comprehensive settlement. So as to have a lasting solution here, an inter-Sudanese dialogue need to be based on the principles of inclusion, and this means involving in this process all of the influential political forces and ethnic and confessional groups, including the authoritative regional leaders. We call upon the trilateral mechanism, UN, AU, and IGAD, to continue efforts to support working on the constitutional document, which could unite the whole country around it. We think it's counterproductive and unacceptable to exert any kind of external influence into the affairs of the friendly country of Sudan. We are convinced that the citizens of their country can and should, on their own, resolve their internal issues. Mr. President, the long period of internal political turbulence and the renewed outbursts of violence impact the situation in socio-economical sphere negatively. A considerable share of the population of Sudan lives below the poverty line. There is a lack of foodstuffs in the country. In this connection, what becomes particularly topical is the issue of the international commitment honoring its commitment to extend financial assistance. We call upon the special political mission to finally, very seriously, get down to the issue of unblocking international assistance without preconditions. We think it's hypocritical to link this issue to the transition to a civilian government in the country. Overall, we must acknowledge that the outcome of UNITAM's activity under its mandate so far have not fully met our expectations. The main efforts of the mission are concentrated in only one area, and the yearly reports which are being prepared contain unbalanced assessments, whereas the Sudanese vision of the situation is being overlooked to a large extent. Mr. President, we highly value the efforts made by the Sudanese leadership to stabilize the situation in Darfur and to implement the Judah peace agreement. Given the periodic outbursts of intertribal violence, we expect that the central and the local authorities will continue to expeditiously undertake all measures to react to them. We support the request by Khartoum to review the outdated Security Council sanctions, and this is something that is reflected in the consolidated position by the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the League of Arab States, and the Regional Group of African States here in New York. We remain convinced that the current situation in Darfur is something that requires an immediate lifting of the restrictions which were imposed 18 years ago. We hope that this issue will be resolved as quickly as possible in line with the Security Council Resolution 2676 passed this month. Mr. President, in conclusion, I would like to reaffirm that the Russian Federation stands always ready to continue with the friendly country of Sudan in assisting them to overcome the current difficulties and returning to sustainable development. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Mr. President, I thank Special Representative Perthes for updating us on the recent developments in Sudan. We recognize and continue to support the collective efforts of the AU, IGAD, and UNITAMS, and I also welcome the participation of Ambassador Al-Harith Mohammed in today's meeting. This briefing comes at a historic moment for Sudan. Earlier this month, the Security Council adopted a resolution that sets the tone for UN engagement in Sudan going forward. At the initiative of the A3 and the United Arab Emirates, it outlines a clear timeframe to determine the future of the Sudan sanctions regime. Almost 2 decades since such measures were imposed, a sunset clause of this kind is critical as we chart a course for lifting sanctions in the near future. The meeting today also coincides with the launch of the final phase of the political process. Despite the challenges faced throughout last year, Sudan launched a dialogue supported by the trilateral mechanism with the aim of achieving a sustainable political solution led and owned by the Sudanese people. As highlighted by SRSG Perthes in his statement, Sudan's commitment has borne fruit since the signing of the political framework agreement in December, including the plans to sign the final political agreement and adopt the transitional constitution. With these positive steps in their early stages, the UAE believes that now, more than ever, the Council and the broader international community must unite in support of Sudan and its people. This means, first and foremost, helping to address the challenges and obstacles that Sudan has faced, including the lack of financial resources needed to implement the Juba peace agreement. It also means creating the environment necessary for the Sudanese people to forge meaningful and lasting progress in the political process. As such, I'd like to focus on 3 critical issues. First, the completion of the transitional period in Sudan remains contingent upon broad political consensus. We believe that what unifies Sudanese stakeholders far outweighs that which divides them. And here we commend the recent efforts to expand the range of parties involved in the political process. We are under no illusions that crafting a way forward will require huge effort by all actors, both to overcome their differences and to work towards a consensus whilst also building trust. This is, in our view, the only way to achieve a truly Sudan-led and Sudan-owned solution and a peaceful way forward. Second, the ongoing diplomatic efforts in the political process must be accompanied by decisive support to the Sudanese economy. Both tracks are complementary and mutually reinforcing. The economy tipped into recession last year, and inflation remains in triple digits, among the highest in the world. Humanitarian actors estimate that about 15.8 million people, about a third of the population, will need humanitarian assistance this year. This is 1.5 million more than last year and is the highest since 2011. Peace does not occur in a vacuum. The material conditions for progress are critical to addressing inequalities and promoting sustainable peace. Sudan needs international support to be able to develop its own capacity to respond to emergencies and channel critical resources to achieve long-term stability. In light of Sudan's vulnerability to climate shocks, we emphasize the need for a comprehensive response enabling climate adaptation and community resilience as well. Third, while the Secretary General has reported a decrease in security incidents, the continued security challenges need to be tackled. We remain concerned by the increase in intercommunal violence, including the events that led to the death of a peacebuilding advisor in Blue Nile State. We are encouraged by the efforts made by local and religious leaders to diffuse tensions. The dialogues facilitated by UNITAMs at the community level in various areas of Sudan that contribute to alleviating tensions between communities should be built upon. These efforts remain an essential pillar for the consolidation of peaceful coexistence in the country. We also recognize the vital role of the Permanent Ceasefire Committee in Darfur as it continues its activities and engagement with the parties to ensure implementation. In conclusion, Mr. President, the UAE remains steadfast in its commitment to supporting the Sudanese people in their quest for stability and prosperity. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President, and I also thank Special Representative Perthes for his briefing, and I also welcome Sudan's permanent representative to this meeting. Malta strongly supports a civilian-led transition in Sudan, which, once established, will reflect the aspirations of the Sudanese people. We also welcome the signing of the Political Framework Agreement last December, and urge both signatories and non-signatories to fully engage and join the political process, and call on Sudan's authorities to establish and sustain a conducive environment towards a safe, inclusive civic space. President, the inclusion of all stakeholders, including women, youth, and civil society in all spheres of decision-making is critical. It is only with the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women that the realities of all Sudanese can be included in the final political settlement. Malta calls on signatories to uphold their commitment to include a minimum 40% representation of women in legislative, executive, and sovereign bodies, and we commend UNITAM's support to this end. The courage displayed by Sudanese women in their resolute path towards peace and democracy is inspiring and commendable. While they play a key role, they continue being at high risk of sexual and gender-based violence, including conflict-related sexual violence. This holds most true for internally displaced women who engage in livelihood activities outside camps. The low number of reported cases indicates the high rate of reluctance by victims to report due to stigma and victim shaming. In this connection, Malta reiterates its call for accountability. Justice to all victims, including those living in remote areas where justice is more inaccessible, must be served. Perpetrators must be held accountable. We also underline the need for timely and impartial investigations on any allegations of unlawful use of force on protesters. Children also remain severely violated. Malta welcomes the collaboration between Sudan's national authorities and the UN, which has led to a roadmap based on the 2016 Action Plan for Ending and Preventing Child Recruitment, and a subsequent verification mission to Darfur to verify allegations of recruitment and use of children by parties to the conflict. President, while we welcome the release of Darfuri detainees in Khartoum, we remain deeply concerned with renewed intercommunal violence in Sudan, including in Darfur. We strongly condemn the killing of a peace-building advisor in the Blue Nile State and call for urgent protection of aid workers in the country. Turning to the humanitarian situation, we are deeply concerned that Sudan's humanitarian needs have now reached record levels. 1/3 of the population requires humanitarian assistance. with the situation expected to worsen this year. Climate-induced shocks have also driven displacement and competition over shrinking resources following years of political misguidance and impunity. Malta supports a strong financial donor base, including through the EU's humanitarian aid response. We welcome the launch of the 2023 Humanitarian Response Plan for Sudan and acknowledge UN efforts to stand ready in mobilizing partners to resume financial support once the transitional period is complete. Malta also supports UNITAMS. The mission's work should continue unimpeded, and we regret that the administrative impediments hamper its mandate's implementation. We therefore call for full respect by the authorities to operations by UNITAMS and to lift off any restrictions on UN personnel while carrying out their duties. To conclude, Malta reiterates its commitment to Sudanese-led and owned process facilitated by the trilateral mechanism, which will effectively bring solutions towards peace and security in Sudan. We are convinced that by enhancing confidence building, the people of Sudan will hold a future that they deserve. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for the statement. I shall now make a statement on behalf of the A3. Dear colleagues, I make this statement on behalf of the A3, namely Ghana, Gabon, and my own country, Mozambique. I thank Ambassador Harold Edgerman, permanent representative of Ghana, for the report of the Sanctions Committee that he has just submitted for our consideration. The A3 thanks the Special Representative of the Secretary General, Mr. Volker Perthes, for his important briefing and for his work and his team's work in the Sudan. We welcome the presence of Ambassador Idris Mohamed, permanent representative of Sudan, in this meeting. We have taken note of the Secretary General's report and have carefully considered the recommendations contained therein. Sudan is at an important crossroad. As the A3, we recognize the efforts of the Sudanese people to overcome their political, security, and humanitarian challenges that confront them. We remain strongly supportive of the ongoing initiatives to promote national reconciliation, restore constitutional rule, and ensure stability in the country. We therefore reiterate our call on the international community to maintain the needed support and to work in concert with the UNITAMS to facilitate the peace process to end the many years of protracted conflict. On the political front, the A3 welcomes the progress made to guarantee an inclusive political and transition process with the signing on 5th December 2022 of a framework agreement to relaunch the transition process in Sudan and the stalled political process. This agreement, which provides for a 2-year transition period and a fully democratic civilian authority, quote unquote, is a real breakthrough towards a way out of the crisis and the holding of credible, fair, and democratic elections. The A3 urges non-signatory political parties to join the new dynamic driven by these positive developments. We encourage all stakeholders to continue discussions on all the outstanding issues and to continue consultations with all social and political actors with a view to establishing a comprehensive political agreement that takes into account the best interests of the Sudanese people. The A3 strongly echo the call made by the chairperson of the African Union Commission, encouraging all parties to work together in good faith for the establishment of democratic institutions, allowing the return to constitutional order. We note with satisfaction the holding of the Juba Peace Agreement and the completion of peace conference held from 31st January to 3rd February, which provided an opportunity to discuss the issue of women's rights. A3 wishes to stress that women's participation is essential to the success of the political process in the Sudan. We further encourage the signatory parties to implement the commitments of the framework agreement and ensure that women are represented in all spheres, including in decision-making positions in the institutions to be established. The resilience of Sudanese women and their commitment to peace deserve to be highlighted. On the security front, despite the downward trend in insecurity, armed conflict and crime remain major challenges in the Sudan. The A3 remain primarily concerned about the persistence of intercommunal clashes, particularly in Blue Nile, West Kordofan, Southern Kordofan, Central Darfur, North Darfur, and South Darfur. It is regrettable that the civilian populations are still targeted, including women, children, and vulnerable people. We continue to maintain that violence against the civilian population is unacceptable, and we strongly condemn these heinous acts. The A3 encourage UNITAMs to continue to support Sudan through political process facilitation, capacity building, peace building, and development initiatives for the implementation of the national plan for the protection of civilians. In this regard, the A3 note with satisfaction the implementation by UNITAMs of a threat assessment to civilians, the improvement of documentation on conflict-related human rights, and the protection of civilians. We support the Sudanese authorities' efforts to create an environment conducive to the reconstruction of the country. In this regard, we welcome the release of detainees from Darfur, Khartoum, and Port Sudan, as well as the decision to end the use of force against demonstrators and the commitment of the Sudanese authorities to protect the rights of the civilian population. Regarding the humanitarian situation, in order to respond to the serious humanitarian crisis currently affecting Sudan and which has worsened with the increase in the price of basic foodstuffs, the A3 reiterated the appeal for sustained support for the 2023 humanitarian response plan for Sudan. We call on the international community to pay particular attention to the socio-economic situation in the Sudan, exacerbated by rising food and energy prices, which could have serious consequences for the stabilization process. We commend the facilitation role of the trilateral mechanism, which has enabled the revival of the political process, but also the strengthening of donor assistance and the peace-building fund. The A3 affirms its commitment and support to the important work of the African Union, IGAD, and the UNITAMS, and in close cooperation with the international partners to stabilize the situation in Sudan, including the United Nations, in accordance with an approach that respects the principles of Sudanese sovereignty in dealing with their own affairs. In conclusion, Gabon, Ghana, and Mozambique do reaffirm their solidarity with the people of the South Sudan and call for a Sudanese-led solution to the political impasse to achieve sustainable peace, security, and greater economic development. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of the Sudan.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim.
In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. Thank you very much, President. First of all, I would like to thank Mr. Volker Perthes, Special Representative of the Secretary General and Head of the United Nations Integrated Transition Assistance Mission in Sudan for his briefing, a positive briefing that we've heard today. We'd also like to thank Ambassador Harold, the representative of Ghana, for his positive report on the Sanctions Committee. We would also like to thank all of those delegations who have expressed their support for the positive developments that are ongoing in Sudan. President, as we promised to the Council during the December meeting on the activities of UNITAMS, a framework agreement was signed on the 5th of December with civilian components, including the Forces for Freedom and Change, the Central Council, and other professional entities. This agreement is to be followed up by a definitive agreement which will lead to a 2-year transition period led by an entirely civilian government and with the commitment of the military side to withdraw from political life. We have reiterated our support for the agreement, as well as all parties' efforts to reach a final agreement, paving the way for the establishment of a transitional government. And this military component has urged partners to join this historic agreement to make sure that we will have a government that will lead the country towards free and transparent elections at the end of the transition period. The civilian signatories have begun the implementation of a plan that is geared towards achieving the broadest possible national consensus to prepare for the final signature. This plan lays out regional contacts, the establishment of a consultation committee with the relevant stakeholders on the questions that were outstanding, and also the holding of workshops and conferences to explain the agreement. The study of the agreement, which was postponed, is continuing with the aim of reaching the broadest possible consensus through the establishment of specialized workshops and meetings that scientific professionals are taking part in to ensure that we can assess the peace agreement, that we can dismantle the previous regime, and also deal with the situation in the east of the country. I would like to mention the fact that last week an important meeting took place with the President and the Vice President of the Sovereignty Council, the civilian signatories of the framework agreement, as well as the trilateral mechanism with the establishment, with the presence of other important regional stakeholders. The meeting focused on the political process and on elements that have been achieved. The results of this meeting were very significant, namely the establishment, the conclusion of discussions on transitional justice, the security and military reform through the various workshops, and also the establishment of a trilateral mechanism and the meeting of signatories and non-signatories to begin immediately the establishment of a draft final agreement. A decision was taken for the relevant committees between the signatory forces and the trilateral mechanism to update a timetable to conclude the outstanding tasks and to sign the final agreement as soon as possible. Ladies and gentlemen, when it comes to the implementation of the Juba peace agreement, the transition government signed last month with the relevant movements that joined the Juba peace agreement a timetable for the implementation of the outstanding issues of the agreement. This timetable was set out after a 5-day workshop that was responsible for looking into the implementation of the agreement under the auspices of the government and the government of South Sudan. This led to an updated matrix for the implementation of the agreement, and this was supported by the government and partners of the peace process. This matrix was also signed on the 12th of February 2023 by the President of the Transitional Sovereignty Council and the President of the Republic of South Sudan. In addition to the parties to the peace process, the heads and leaders of organizations and groups that signed the agreement, without forgetting the representatives of the countries of the region who are guarantors and witnesses of the agreement. The work to implement the matrix underscored that peace remains the key, and it is the outstanding priority for the country. The commitment to implement the new matrix was reiterated in line with the timetable so as to complete the implementation of the outstanding issues of the agreement. The transition government is committed to ensure the implementation of the updated matrix in line with its new timetables so as to create a strong momentum to iron out the final issues. Peace is the key issue in Sudan, and it is the overarching priority of the state. It is the key for security issues and development questions in the country. The government will spare no efforts to ensure the positive and constructive participation in the negotiations with other factions who have not yet joined the peace process. In this context, we would like to reiterate our determination to promote the protection of civilians in Darfur, notably women and children, so that we can preserve human dignity and uphold the rights that Sudan has committed to when it joined the relevant international instruments. We are continuing work to implement the National Plan for the Protection of Civilians and the deployment of joint forces for the protection of civilians. This is one of our most important priorities in Darfur. We can add to this the collection of small arms and light weapons which have not been declared, and the establishment of a disarmament, demobilization and reintegration program. The government of Sudan, through its scarce resources, have nevertheless been able to provide to the joint forces for the protection of civilians some 200 new vehicles. These vehicles have been equipped to support the forces' tasks. You are also aware that the situation in Darfur is getting progressively better, and many displaced persons and refugees have started to go back to their villages and their places of origin. In addition, the situation in the Blue Nile and West Kordofan, which had seen tribal tensions, is now going back to normality thanks to the measures that have been taken by the government. President, the outcome of the workshop to assess the implementation of the Juba Agreement aims to get rid of obstacles and to ensure that this can be achieved. The international community must respect its financial obligations to implement the security measures to protect civilians and to work to ensure that all other movements can join the peace process. I would like to take this opportunity to call on the international community to guarantee financial support to complete the implementation of the outstanding provisions of the Juba Agreement, in particular the security provisions of the agreement and the DDR process and the integration of the forces is an extremely costly and complex task from an organizational, logistical, and financial point of view. We would like to thank those friendly countries who have always supported these efforts, and we stress the fact that UNITAMS has a role to play in this domain, a role that it has to play better than we are seeing today. Ladies and gentlemen, Sudan ensures cooperation with human rights mechanisms, and a UN expert on the human rights situation has carried out a visit to Sudan last February. In this visit, the expert received assurances from the Foreign Affairs Ministry and the Justice Ministry with regards to the availability of Sudan to cooperate with him and to facilitate his mission. In addition, the expert observed the progress that had been made in human rights file and in Sudan's commitments to ensure accountability, to combat impunity, and to uphold civil and political rights. The SG's report that you have seen, which is S/154/2023, speaks about the difficult economic situation in the country. We share the SG's opinion, and we are expecting the relaunch of the assistance program for development with our bilateral partners who wish to see a successful transition in Sudan, in addition to international financial assistance to ensure that we can undertake the necessary reforms and so that we can reduce the burden of external debt. This reduction that Sudan has a right to, in line with the efforts that we have taken through the initiatives for highly indebted poor countries, and the international community, in addition, must shoulder its responsibilities by providing all humanitarian assistance to the hundreds of thousands of refugees from neighborly countries that Sudan has hosted. The report recognized the positive developments and the improvements thanks to the facilitation of the bilateral agreements through the various measures that have been taken and the joining of the various movements to the Juba Agreement, as well as professional associations and trade unions, the signature of the political agreement last December, in addition to the signing of the declaration that will be joined by the Force of Liberty and Change, the Minister of Finance, Mr. Manawi, Governor of the State of Darfur, and Commander of the Sudanese Liberation Army. The commitments of the military to withdraw, or rather to strengthen the momentum and to contribute to the process, this has become a criterion for the transition in the wake of this announcement that was made at the UN last year. The political process will be continually strengthened by including participants, including IDPs and resistance communities, young people, and pastoral sectors, as well as women's representatives. This participation is estimated to be between 26 and 35%, and this is something that we don't even see in some developed countries. In addition to this, efforts have been made last week by the political authorities to contain differences of opinion, as well as to promote national unity and to ensure that we can make headway with representatives of the Umma Party, the Unionist Democratic Party, the Movement for Justice and Equality, the Umma Party, the Democratic Alliance, the United Popular Front, the Beja Tribes Supreme Council, and other independent groups. Other consultations were launched to communicate with the movement of the North, hope with regards to them joining the process. The role of the UN is to support the national process and to adopt a peaceful approach and to engage in multilateral dialogue by fine-tuning the security measures to ensure that we can facilitate the return of IDPs. President, the report of the SG mentions what he calls administrative obstacles hampering the work of the mission. I would not have thought that this is the appropriate forum to discuss this. The report mentions the lack of issuance of visas and restrictions on freedom of movement. This is not correct. We have information that states clearly that the deliverance of visas and authorizations for travel required by the mission have been certified in line with the administrative hierarchy of the mission that was adopted by the General Assembly. I would like to mention the following in this regard. When it comes to paragraph 61, the mission states that delays in the issuance of entry visas for 19 staff members and delays in travel, this has been mentioned, but 11 staff whose entry visas were certified, these names were mentioned in the aforementioned information. 5 members whose information has not yet been clarified by the mission. These are people. Are these people who have been added to the figures, or have they replaced other staff? We have asked the mission for clarifications, but they haven't got back to us yet. In paragraph 61, the mission said that issues have been delayed, but after we looked into this issue, it seems that the number of ceasefire officials, 27, and this is the figure that has been accepted by all, these officials have not had to wait for their visas. We have also heard about alleged constraints on their freedom of movement, but after looking into these issues, we can see that the Sudanese authorities have not opposed or banned the travel of the staff members until the agreement on the waivers that had to be fulfilled and were completed by the mission and the Foreign Affairs Ministry in January 2023 and for a period of 6 months. All of these issues were agreed, and there are no further outstanding issues to iron out. In paragraphs 61 and 74, information about the alleged lack of cooperation with the mission and alleged obstacles. This information is not correct. On the contrary, the Sudanese authorities have cooperated with the mission at all times, and no travel has been impeded. And this is pertinent with regards to the ceasefire officials. We would like to state that there is an executive national committee which is made up of state institutions and is responsible for getting rid of any obstacles to the mission's work and to lead its work in line with the matrix and in harmony with the 4 strategic goals that the mission has. These goals are considered to be an absolute priority for Sudan when it comes to the mission's operations, and we welcome the achievements that have been made. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, I would like to reiterate that the partners of the transition period will continue their efforts to ensure that this period can be successful. We are committed to respect dialogue, which is an indispensable way of overcoming the challenges in the political transition. We renew our commitment to work with the international community to address the challenges that there are in the transition process, and so to do this to attain the goals we have set ourselves. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of the Sudan for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I wish to invite you, Council members, to informal consultations to continue our discussion. The meeting is adjourned.
I'd like to welcome you all at our press conference dedicated to the 20th anniversary of the US invasion of Iraq. We're having Russian PR Ambassador Vasily Nebenzia as a speaker. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Good afternoon once again. Thank you very much for sacrificing part of your lunchtime. I hope I will still leave you some time for that as well. As you might have noticed, initially in today's program of work of the Security Council, we had briefing on 1591 committee and briefing and consultations on UNITAMS. Then there came a request from Western delegations to, I quote, schedule a briefing on Monday following ICBM launches. But as soon as they learned that we plan to raise 20th anniversary of US aggression against Iraq at the AOB, and the only possible way to do it would be in the course of UNITAMS consultations, they started, I will not hesitate to say, dirty procedural maneuvering, insisting that the briefing on DPRK comes first, and only then briefing and consultations on 1591 on UNITAMS. By doing so, they clearly wanted to blur the effect of our AOB, since under such scenario, it would run well into the afternoon lunch break. They also wanted to secure afternoon's US area on LGBTQ, which could have happened in parallel with the DPRK meeting if UNITAMS and our AOB happened first. Of course, this item is very uncomfortable for US primarily and their allies as well. So this clearly demonstrates that the US is not interested in exposing their crimes in Iraq and elsewhere, and that the LGBTQ issues have much more significant place in their priorities than ensuring accountability for crimes in Iraq. So we will try to correct it now at this press conference. 20 years ago, on 20th March 2003, the US Armed Forces and their allies started an invasion of Iraq on the pretext of searching for and destroying of weapons of mass destruction. It was done in violation of the Charter of the United Nations and international law, and it plunged the country into years of chaos from which it has not fully recovered till today. Before the invasion, the United Nations Special Commission, and later the United Nations Monitoring, Verification and Inspection Commission, had spent 12 years looking for biological, chemical, and other types of WMDs in Iraq. The White House claimed that there were hidden stocks in Iraq. Baghdad denied it. However, on February 5, 2003, US Secretary of State Colin Powell addressed the Security Council accusing the Iraqi leaders of producing weapons of mass destruction. He presented an infamous vial containing white powder as evidence, which was allegedly anthrax agent found in Iraq. As early as the following month, the United States and its allies launched an armed invasion in Iraq. Eventually, they found no WMDs in Iraq. The head of state, Saddam Hussein, was toppled and later executed, while the country delved into a years-long internal military and political conflict. But it was not one of the internal conflicts which happened for various reasons in other countries. It was a conflict that took place during the occupation of the territory in question by the United States, and it was directly ignited and fueled by Western countries of the anti-Iraq coalition, which had no common border with Iraq and which was thousands of miles away from them, and which, as it turned out, posed no threat to the invaders. According to Western sources, the invasion and the subsequent occupation of Iraq resulted in 200,000 to 205,000 civilian deaths, which in direct civilian losses amounting to about 650,000. These military operations also resulted in the destruction of Iraqi basic infrastructure a disastrous decline in their national health system, and a surge in crime and later terrorism. This has led to a profound, protracted socio-economic crisis. The number of Iraqi refugees in Syria and Jordan and internally displaced persons has reached 1.5 million and 2 million respectively. Such drastic losses among civilian population and untold protracted suffering of Iraqi citizens were literally calling for accountability. The International Criminal Court has had full jurisdiction over crimes committed by Western soldiers and those who gave them orders. However, it failed to do anything to bring those in persons to justice. Year after year, the sections in the ICC reports dedicated to investigation of Western crimes in Iraq were becoming shorter and more general, until they completely disappeared. This was a result of an innovative strategy of the new ICC prosecutor Karim Khan, who decided to deprioritize investigations into this and other situations involving crimes committed by the West. This step perfectly illustrates real priority of the ICC, which have nothing to do with justice. At the same time, Washington consistently disregarded the International Committee of the Red Cross reports about cruel treatment of Iraqi prisoners and investigations conducted by Western NGOs, including Human Rights Watch, which implicated U.S. service personnel in Iraq in systematic killings, torture, and rapes of civilians. The U.S. tried to hush up absolutely everything. They hushed up scandals caused by media leaks about torture at the Abu Ghraib and Camp Bucca prisons, including the Iraqi war logs published by WikiLeaks. Washington also cynically covered up crimes committed by the personnel of the U.S. private military companies. In December 2020, U.S. President Donald Trump pardoned 4 employees of Blackwater, an infamous private military company, despite condemnation by the UN Working Group on the use of mercenaries. The 4 individuals were found guilty of killing 14 civilians on Nisur Square in Baghdad in 2007. Apart from completely demolishing Iraqi statehood and the country's military, economic, and social foundations, the aggression against Iraq irreparably damaged its cultural and historical legacy. After U.S. forces seized Baghdad on April 9, 2003, rampant looting and robberies swept the city. The National Museum and other cultural sites in the capital also badly suffered. These crimes later spread to major Iraqi archaeological sites. U.S. service personnel smuggled ancient artifacts out of Iraq. During the entire period of occupation, plane loads of items were smuggled out using special aircraft. According to the management of the National Museum alone, 15,000 exhibits are reported missing. No more than 6,000 have been returned to date. Consequently, the U.S. have failed to fulfill their promise to establish the so-called prosperity in Iraq. However, they destroyed a lifestyle that had evolved over centuries and undermined the fragile interdenominational balance. The country turned into a hotbed of regional instability for many years, which subsequently gave rise to ISIS, which consisted also of many former Iraqi military. In fact, U.S. is a godfather of ISIS, which it later had to fight. Same happened in Afghanistan, where U.S. supported Al-Qaeda against the Soviets, who later turned against their former sponsors. It's hard even to calculate how many lives those U.S. adventures claimed. Later, the leaders of the countries involved in the invasion attempted to justify their criminal actions by claiming that they had been given inaccurate information by their own intelligence services. But no one was punished for this, and many continue to serve now. On the contrary, many of those who exposed U.S. crimes were punished and prosecuted or persecuted. One of them was Julian Assange, who was set up under a bogus claim and now awaits extradition to the U.S. from the U.K. Another one to be persecuted was former UN Inspector Scott Ritter, who exposed U.S. claims on WMDs in Iraq. He also was set up and accused of a crime that he always denied. And now the US, who tarnished his name, barred him from participating in the Security Council meetings. After 20 years, the lessons from the US aggression in Iraq are still not learned. US has not officially apologized or acknowledged the devastating consequences of its fabricated aggression. Many of those who warmongered then continue to warmonger now, advocating for more weapons to be sent to Ukraine to fuel NATO proxy war with Russia in Ukraine until the last Ukrainian, and claiming that before 24th February 2022, the world hasn't seen anything more terrible, as if the world started only on that day. We also must not forget and forgive those terrible US crimes and remember the names who still await accountability for their role in triggering the hoax Iraq crisis. Among the living US architects of the Iraqi war are inter alia George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, John Bolton, Condoleezza Rice, and last but not least, Joe Biden himself, who then headed the Senate's Foreign Relations Committee. We must also stand up to the criminal methods used by the US in the case of Iraq. The Iraqi scenario was followed in Syria, with ISIS nearly seizing the country, and it was only Russia's military interference that prevented this scenario from happening. While addressing you, I would like to remind you of the role that the media can play in drumming up the political warmongering campaign. That is exactly what happened in Iraq, and such names as David Frum, Jeffrey Goldberg, Jonathan Chait, Fareed Zakaria, Anne Applebaum, Christian Amanpour, as well as some others, will always be associated with the way Iraqi war was presented. Some of them, as you may see, have drawn no conclusions and today continue to serve the interests of the US establishment, spreading lies in the Ukrainian context. Iraq has been a prologue, a precursor, a prodrome to what happened later in the Middle East, even more to geopolitical events that we've been witnessing and are witnessing today. So today is a good opportunity to reflect on what kind of world we are having today and where we are all heading if we let US draw us into another reckless adventure, this time in Europe.
Okay. Any questions? You do. Then.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association for coming to the briefing room. Some of us were here and at UN headquarters on that day 20 years ago. But today we are watching another war unfold in Europe between Russia and Ukraine. And I think all of us would like to know your thoughts on this day of the 20th anniversary and on a day when the president of China is in Moscow, on how the current war can end and what are the prospects, since we hear all sorts of news about possible offensives in the spring, and the spring starts tonight.
First of all, the genesis of these two events is absolutely different. Iraq is thousands of miles away from the territory where the aggression came from, and it posed no threat to the US, which was later discovered and proved, in fact. While what we are witnessing in Europe, as you say, we had all legitimate reasons to believe that what was happening before it all started was a threat to Russian national security. And that's where it all came for, and that's why the special military operation began. The goals of the special military operation were clearly stated, to defend the people of Donbass who were threatened by the Ukrainian nationalists, and I said many times, had Minsk agreements been implemented, nothing what we are witnessing today would be happening. On the spring offensive, I think that you are addressing a wrong person. I'm not a military strategist. I'm not, and I'm not privy to plans that the military are having. Perhaps the Ministry of Defense would be better place to tell it to you, but I'm not sure it will.
What about the end? My question about seeing how this current war is going to end.
When Ukrainians realize the reality and not will be coming with absolutely important plans, so-called peace plans, as they say, peace plans that that provide for Russia to surrender. That will not happen. When they become realistic, and I think they will become more and more realistic with the situation on the battlefield, then they will be perhaps more ready for negotiating seriously.
James.
James Bays, Al Jazeera. On the point of international law, you said, as so many Russian officials have said, as Ambassador Churkin before you said, that 2003 was a violation of the Charter and of international law. I get that. Why is Russia's invasion of Ukraine also not a violation of the Charter and international law and therefore illegal? And if I may ask one other question as the permanent representative of the Russian Federation to the United Nations, you know, obviously, that your leader is now not just the president of the Russian Federation, he's also a wanted man under the International Criminal Court. How will this affect his travel? And in particular, can he now visit, as world leaders do, the United Nations in Geneva or New York? Or is that now impossible for him?
First of all, the decision of the ICC is absolutely null and void for us. ICC simply demonstrated that it went to new laws for which it was heading already a long time. You know that we are not signatories. We are signatories, but we are not statutory member of the ICC. So for us, effectively, that means nothing. How it will affect travel?
Practically, it does mean he can't come here, for example, can he?
Well, the world is not focused on New York. You know, there are other places where he can travel. How it will affect
123 countries he can't go to.
Sorry?
123 countries are signatories to the Rome Statute that governs the ICC. He can't go to any of those, can he?
That only proves that the decision that was made was purely political, and it was made for the purpose of ostracizing and it doesn't, of course, bring us anywhere closer to meaningful negotiations, which Western countries are not demonstrated the will for anyway. How it will affect travel, I'm not sure I will be able to answer you legally, so to say. I'm not an expert in these issues. I'm sure that this decision is being studied in Moscow, but it was already commented that for us it will effectively mean nothing.
And in terms of the legality, the comparison you made, the very, the point that you Russian officials have made every single time since 2003 about the violation of the Charter and international law. Why isn't what you've done exactly the same?
I think we did not do exactly the same. I already answered this question partly when saying that the genesis of both crises are absolutely different. While Iraq was a hoax, Ukrainian threat and later the proxy war of the West with Russia is a reality.
Thanks, Ambassador. A follow-up to James' question. On Friday, you mentioned that Russia will be holding an ARIA meeting in early April. Is that meeting intended as some sort of a rebuttal to the indictment of President Putin by the ICC?
Not at all. We we planned that meeting long before, and that meeting will be on the issue which is so often is being raised today about the Ukrainian children in Russia. And we would like to brief our fellow Security Council member and the rest of the membership on what the real situation with them in Russia is.
And then just a quick follow-up to this morning's meeting, which ended with a bit of back and forth between yourselves, China, the US and the UK. Are you engaging at all with the US on the PRST for North Korea?
We are engaging on any document that the Security Council is discussing or negotiating. But I don't know what will come out of this PRST yet.
Do you think there should be one?
I think that we should demonstrate restraint in these issues, because while accusing DPRK in all the misdeeds that they are doing, U.S. and its allies and their allies, they forget that they make actions which DPRK consider extremely hostile. For right, for wrong, that's another question. But that's another example of a security dilemma. What seems offensive for one seems defensive for another.
Linda and Pamela.
Linda Fasulo, NPR at the UN. This is a follow-up to Edie's question and her question about the prospects for ending the war. I believe you said something to the effect that the Ukrainians are not realistic about what their demands are for ending the war, and that to end the war, they have to become more realistic. My question is, can you expand in terms of what you see or what Russia sees in terms of being realistic, Ukraine's being realistic in terms of peace talks?
We put forward the objective of our special military operations. They are very, very well known. Demilitarization, denazification, and the neutral status of Ukraine. When they are ready to discuss it again, we will engage. We never objected or rejected negotiating these things with them. In fact, this was negotiated in March and April 2022, and there was a draft agreement already prepared, to which Ukrainians gave their draft consent, I would put it that way. But then in middle of April, they simply withdrew on the orders of their sponsors, and that's it.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Ambassador, for the briefing. It's Pamela Falk from CBS. My question is a follow-up, a variation on the previous questions. The president of China, Xi Jinping, is in Moscow. Xi Jinping has proposed a 12-point peace plan that the U.S. and Ukraine reject, or Ukraine and the U.S. reject. Is there any possibility that there would be a new peace plan proposed during or after? Do you see anything in that front? And on the separate and apart, do you expect your president to continue to travel to South Africa, a member of the ICC? Thanks.
On travel, I already answered. On new peace plans, we hear and heard a lot of offers for mediation, but they were quite empty, frankly. Except for the willingness to mediate, there was nothing behind it, nothing substantive. I don't know about any forthcoming peace plans, but if any such plan appears, of course we will study it first.
All right, and just a quick follow-up on Michelle's question. On the ARIA in April on children, that was obviously the topic of the background for the reason for the arrest warrant issued by the ICC.
Sorry?
The deportation of children, it was the subject of the arrest warrant, one of them. I know we'll hear more about it in April, but what is your short answer to why those children have been removed from Ukraine to either Russian-occupied territories or Russia? Thank you.
Simply because we wanted to spare them of the danger that military activities may bring. That's it. The issue of children brought to Russia forcefully is totally overblown, and that's why we want to show it at the Area Formula meeting. That's it.
And is the intention to return them?
Well, when conditions are safe, of course. Why not?
Okay.
Hi, Ambassador. Dejashu with China Central Television. Just a quick question, because everybody seems linked the Iraqi war with the current ongoing special operation in Ukraine. Just before you came here, I asked the spokesperson of the Secretary General, I asked him whether the current Secretary General think that Iraqi war is illegal or not. He said the focus of the current Secretary General is on peace, promoting peace and development and rebuilding. And he didn't really answer my question and whether it's illegal or against the UN Charter. But it's very obvious that UN's stand on this Ukrainian conflict is that Russia is the invader and it's against UN Charter and it's illegal. So I just want to know what's your response.
Secretary General is sometimes very shy on many issues, while vocal on others. And it's not always balanced, I will put it very mildly. I'd like to draw your attention, perhaps many of you already read it, to an article in The Guardian today. 2 decades later, it feels as if the US is trying to forget the Iraq war ever happened. And that's what is happening now. Yes, they try to pretend as if that is an event of the long time past, which we have already passed and should not remember. I will give you just 2 quotes out of this article, which I recommend you read. President Biden, after delivering his remarks, Biden declared, the idea that over 200,000 forces would invade another country since World War II, nothing like that has happened, he said. And the second quote from the article, Biden was thinking only of Europe, but neglected to say so, in which case he treated the West's history as synonymous with the world's. And that is the problem. The problem is that while they focus on events of today, they forget about events of the past, for which they never apologize, by the way.
Sorry, but I'm just asking you about the position from the UN, not US. You know, interestingly, I also asked this question. I asked Farhan. I said, do you think that UN has been misused as a political means of the United States? And he said, obviously not. So, your opinion?
I will say obviously yes.
Stefano Vaccara, Voce New York. Thank you, Ambassador, for this press briefing on Iraq. I ask you a question I don't know if you can answer as an ambassador, but maybe as a scholar of international relations. Do you think that if the United States and the UK didn't break the Charter 20 years ago, maybe your president would not have invaded Ukraine and maybe will have tried to resolve the problem in a different way? And then I have a second question.
I think that history doesn't have subjunctive mood. We live in the history that happened and we cannot change it. what would have happened if US and UK didn't invade Iraq. As I said, Iraq was a precursor to later events in the Middle East, and also to events that happened geopolitically. I will give you one quote. Perhaps that is exactly the right time to do so. It's a short one. Be patient with me. American exceptionalism turned especially destructive after the end of the Cold War. Since 1992, the United States has fought several devastating wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Somalia, and elsewhere, without achieving the political outcomes it sought. The link between these wars and the end of the Cold War is not incidental. Former NATO commander Wesley Clark spelled out the linkage in several books and interviews. After the first Gulf War in 1991, General Clark dropped into Pentagon to see Paul Wolfowitz, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy at that time. Wolfowitz told Clark that, I quote, "We did learn on one thing that's very important from the Gulf War. With the end of the Cold War, we can now use our military with impunity. The Soviets won't come in to block us, and we've got 5, maybe 10 years to clean up these old Soviet surrogate regimes like Iraq and Syria before the next superpower emerges to challenge us. We could have a little more time, but no one really knows." That's perhaps an answer to your question, whether or not US could or could not invade Iraq.
Yeah, no, my question was a little bit different, Ambassador. I'm sorry, maybe it was my fault. I just think, this is myself, I think that Putin or Russia probably will have been much more difficult to take the decision to invade Ukraine because it will have been the first one to break such a blunt way the charter. It didn't have instead the example done 20 years before. But my second question was on actually the Nord Stream. Well, since of the last Security Council meeting dedicated to that, few things have happened. I mean, we saw the German investigations. There was something coming out of there, and the New York Times article. So it's not only Hirsch article. So and your president also talked about it. So question is, what do you think about the last events about the investigation? And what happened if, I mean, you are asking also the UN, you're still asking that, you say that you trust Secretary General on this investigation. So what's happening about that? I mean, are they coming to investigate or not? And what happened exactly? What do you predict will happen if Russia, maybe within the Security Council, is able to prove that the United States was behind this terrorist attack?
First things first, on your first question. The decision to start special military operation was not based on the example of the Iraqi war. It was justified by other reasons, by other geopolitical context, and by things that were happening around Russia since already a long time. And we've been warning our Western then friends since 2007, since the Putin Munich speech, that the way you are treating Russia will not lead us anywhere. They never listened. They never listened. They just shrugged it off and pretended that we were claiming something which they never envisaged, they never thought about. But what transpired after these things happened, that they did envisage, they did plan, and they eagerly jumped on that train. I'm not talking even about the sanctions, but even the way the sanctions were introduced demonstrates that they were preparing for it. And in fact, that was leaked by some of them, that they planned these sanctions a long time before. And they introduced it swiftly as soon as it started. So I wouldn't link the two events directly because, again, they have different context and different genesis. On the Northern Stream, on the Nord Stream, Russia was sidelined from the investigation, although it has the full right to do so as the owner of the pipeline. The investigation that is being conducted by the three countries, whatever revelations they produce, they are not shared with us. I mean, that we asked those countries to participate in that investigation. Denmark, Sweden, and Germany, and we were denied. Now, what comes out, it's clearly an act of sabotage. The question is who did it. There are various evidence. There is this Hirsch article. He said recently that he had more evidence which he hesitates to betray because the sources that provided him with that evidence he would not like them to be compromised, and that's why we turned to UN for an independent investigation which will involve us as well, I hope, so that we can do it through different means, since through the regular means, which how it should be conducted in the normal circumstances, we cannot find any way out. That's why we produced a resolution that we are negotiating, debating yet. And I think we will introduce it sometime soon in the Security Council. And we'll see how our partners will react. Their reaction will also be very telling.
Sorry, what's that resolution?
Huh?
What's the resolution?
On the investigation on the Nord Stream.
Oh, you haven't put it. Yeah, when are you going to put it to a vote?
Sorry?
When will you put that to a vote before the end of March?
Perhaps. Perhaps.
Do you think you have the numbers? Do you think you have the numbers?
It's not the matter even of the numbers. It's the matter of seeing who votes how.
Okay, sorry, you just didn't answer to what will happen. I mean, do you, if you can prove that, for example, United States is behind this,
I don't want even to speculate on that issue. These are still allegations which were not yet proved, although the evidence is perhaps, if not overwhelming, but very convincing. Because indeed, this could have been done only by those who can afford such an operation, which is extremely technologically difficult.
Okay, let's go online. Abdel Hamid wants to ask the question.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. My name is Abdel Hamid Payam, and I from Al Arabi. I appreciate your press conference. It is personal to me. I was working with Sergio Vieira de Mello myself, and I witnessed some of what you have just told, especially about the museum and other crimes committed in Iraq in front of my eyes. So, and I also thank you for the analogy between the illegal war in Iraq, claiming that it's a threat to the U.S. national security 5,000 miles away, and what happened in Ukraine. But I also want to raise my voice against the Russian policy. They are too soft on the crimes committed against the Palestinian people. They don't call things bluntly and clearly. that what Israel is doing is crimes against humanity, crimes, and crimes, war crimes. I also see that you are too soft in your relation with Israel, seeing what Israel is doing as an apartheid state, which has been confirmed by 4 international reports that it is an apartheid state. Can you draw some analogy between the crimes Israeli committed and how Western countries treat those crimes, and they're too soft with it, and what happened in Ukraine, and the Western countries call the resistance of Ukrainians heroism, and the crimes committed by Russians is war crimes, but they are silent on those crimes committed by Israel. Thank you very much.
Does the mic work? Yeah. First, I would not agree that we are too soft on the Israeli policies on Palestine. Read my statements on that issue. Tell me who is harder than us on Israelis. I'm not sure that you will give me the names even of the usual suspects these days. This conflict is perhaps the longest in the history of the United Nations, which started from the day one, practically from day one when UN was established, we always have been with the Palestinians on these issues, and we always called for a fair resolution. We never we always called spade a spade. We never tried to justify what Israel is doing in Palestine. The question is that, unfortunately, the Palestinian question issue went somewhat off the radar for many countries, for various reasons. We always said that whatever rapprochement that we are seeing today in the Middle East should not overshadow the issue of issues, the primary issues of the Middle East, the settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I will not fully agree with the assessment Russia takes on Palestine. We are trying our best to mediate, in particular between the Palestinian factions, which are not on very good terms within themselves, and that's a big issue as well. That's a big issue which allows to make this case hang in the air, because the Israelis are claiming they have nobody to deal with because they have not unity among the Palestinian ranks, and unity among Palestinian ranks is one of the prerequisites for negotiating seriously, meaningfully, and with the expectation of a result. We never approved of any peace plans that came out during the Trump administration, for example, or today when Biden administration basically offers economic opportunities instead of the political settlement. And we say it clearly everywhere, including the Security Council.
Okay, one more question from online. Iftikhar, you were raising hand now. Okay. Yeah, Iftikhar, if you are ready.
Thank you very much, sir. My question has been asked.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you then. So, anyone from here?
Is there a date for your area meeting?
Beginning of April, exactly when I cannot tell you, somewhere around 6th of April. Please listen to it. I do appreciate you staying with me during lunchtime, and thank you very much for coming.